May 13, 1943, near Tunis, North Africa. The desert air was sharp with the scent of burning fuel. Black smoke curled upward from abandoned half-tracks, their steel frames twisted by shell fire, while vultures circled lazily overhead. Gefreiter Hans Keller stood among thousands of other German prisoners, sweat plastering his hair beneath the rim of his field cap. The surrender had come swiftly that morning, a tide breaking all at once. Now weapons lay in heaps. Carabiner, 98K rifles stacked like discarded sticks. MG-34 machine guns resting mute in the dust, their barrels still warm from futile resistance. Keller shifted uncomfortably. He had joined the Afrika Korps barely a year earlier, when their commander, Erwin Rommel, had been hailed as the Desert Fox. Victory seemed inevitable then. Now, on this barren Tunisian ridge, the vaunted Corps stood disarmed. The official tallies were staggering. Nearly 267,000 Axis troops, Germans and Italians, captured in a single sweep, the largest mass surrender of the war so far. Keller had seen the numbers only in rumor, but he could feel the scale in the endless lines of prisoners stretching toward the horizon. The Americans came for them in olive-drab trucks, the white star painted bold on every door. Keller watched as his captors organized the prisoners with startling efficiency. They were young men, some scarcely older than himself, but their uniforms were immaculate, their equipment unscarred. Even the trucks smelled new, still reeking of oil and factory paint. To Keller, who had marched in patched boots and rationed gasoline, this American freshness seemed almost unreal. As the prisoners were herded forward, Keller caught sight of the docks in the distance. Ships waited there, huge, blocky silhouettes that seemed to multiply as his column approached. Someone whispered, "Liberty ships." He had heard of them before, in the cautionary lectures German officers gave about American industry. But standing here seeing row upon row of identical hulls, he realized the truth. These were not singular vessels, but mass-produced machines, as common to the Americans as rifles. The numbers, he would later learn, bordered on the impossible. By war's end, the United States would launch 2,710 Liberty ships, each built in an average of just 42 days. American yards produced more shipping tonnage in a single year than the entire Kriegsmarine had commanded since the war began. To Keller, it meant one thing. His journey to captivity was not a logistical miracle. It was simply routine for a nation that seemed to conjure steel from air. The stench of sweat and diesel filled his nostrils as the guards ordered them up the gangways. Keller stumbled, his knees weak from hunger. His last meal had been a crust of bread smeared with thin marmalade, eaten crouched in a foxhole under artillery fire. Now at the ship's rail, an American sergeant thrust something into his hand, a sandwich, thick with meat, and a tin cup of steaming coffee. Keller froze. It had to be a trick. Prisoners were not fed before being shipped away. They were starved, beaten, humiliated. At least, that was what he had been told. But the bread was fresh, the coffee bitter and hot. He swallowed both quickly, shame mingling with relief. Around him, fellow prisoners muttered in disbelief. Some laughed bitterly. Others wept. Keller said nothing. In his mind, the arithmetic had begun to change. If America could hand out bread to its enemies, what must it be giving its soldiers? If prisoners drank coffee, what were the front-line troops drinking? The convoy rumbled out of Tunis as evening settled. Keller leaned against the ship's railing, watching the African coast shrink into shadow. He thought of Bremen, of his mother waiting in a city already scarred by bombs, and felt an ache he could not name. He had no idea yet that in less than a month he would be ordered to write to her. No idea that the enemy would provide the paper, the postage, even the time. As the Liberty ship churned westward, its engines thrumming like the heartbeat of an industrial giant, Keller muttered under his breath, "This cannot be real." He did not know it yet, but the war was already lost. not in desert battles or ruined towns, but in the sheer abundance of steel, ships, and bread that America seemed to summon without end. June 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The cicadas were already loud that morning when Captain James Whitaker unfolded the War Department circular on his desk. He was a schoolteacher in Kansas before the war, the kind of man who knew how to quiet a room of 30 restless teenagers with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Now, in uniform, he commanded something stranger, a camp of thousands of enemy prisoners scattered across Texas cotton fields. Whitaker smoothed the onion-skin paper of the circular and read the latest instructions. It quoted the Geneva Convention of 1929 almost verbatim. Prisoners of war must be allowed to correspond with their families. The orders were precise: 1 letter and 1 postcard per week for enlisted men, limited to 24 lines of script. For generals and field officers, 5 letters and 5 postcards per month. Each message had to be written on U.S.-issued forms carried free of charge through the American postal system, then transferred via the International Red Cross. It seemed a small thing on paper, but Whitaker understood the scale. By May 1945, there would be over 425,000 Axis prisoners in the United States, the majority Germans. Each man was entitled to write regularly. That meant millions of letters, each to be censored, stamped, sorted, and shipped across the Atlantic while U-boats still prowled the seas. In Whitaker's mind, the statistics grew until they seemed larger than any battle he had ever read about in the history books. Outside his office, the camp was waking. The guard towers loomed above 2 sets of barbed wire fences, their spotlights still dim from the night watch. Trucks rattled down the dirt roads, carrying guards to work details and prisoners to farm fields. The Texas sun was already burning away the dew. Whitaker could smell dust, coffee, and the faint tang of creosote from newly cut fence posts. He folded the circular and picked up the rubber stamp that would become his daily companion. In black ink, it read simply, "Passed, U.S. Censor." The letters felt heavy in his hand. Every postcard that left Camp Hearn would bear that mark, a silent guarantee that the enemy's words had crossed American eyes before crossing the ocean. Later that morning, Whitaker addressed his staff of censors, clerks pulled from civilian life, just like him. Some were former postmasters, others bank tellers or school secretaries. They would read every line written in careful German script. Any mention of troop movements, American equipment, or escape plans would be struck out with thick black ink. But they were instructed never to delay a letter as punishment. The War Department was insistent. Discipline could be strict in many ways, but not at the expense of mail. "Gentlemen," Whitaker said, holding up the circular, "our job is not only to guard these men, but to guard their words. The Army wants these letters to go through. Let them write. Let their families read. That is our policy. That is America's policy." There was silence in the small room, broken only by the tick of a wall clock. Some of his clerks looked uneasy. After all, their sons and brothers were still fighting Germans overseas. Letting those same Germans send postcards home felt, at best, merciful, at worst, traitorous. Whitaker knew the doubts. He shared them. But he also believed in the logic behind the order. Brigadier General Archer Lurch, chief of the POW program, had put it bluntly. "We are not going to lower ourselves to Nazi standards." America's power was not only in factories and shipyards, Whitaker reminded himself, but in its ability to abide by rules, even when the enemy broke them. That afternoon, the first batch of capture postcards arrived from the barracks, thin slips filled with names, addresses, and brief assurances of health. Whitaker stamped them one by one, passed, passed, passed. The sound of rubber meeting paper became a rhythm in the office, steady as a drum beat. He watched the stack grow. Each card carried more than ink. It carried evidence of America's abundance. While Germany rationed paper and ink for its own citizens, The United States handed stationery to prisoners. While Allied cities endured shortages, German captives here would send free letters across the ocean. When the last card was stamped, Whitaker leaned back and rubbed his temples. The day was just beginning. He glanced through the window at the barbed wire, the guard towers, and the vast Texas sky. Somewhere in those barracks, men who had once sworn loyalty to Hitler were writing home under American orders. The irony wasn't lost on him. America had captured their bodies. Now, through postcards and letters, it would quietly capture their families' imaginations. July 1943, Bremen, Germany. The sirens began before dawn. Marta Keller shook her son's blanket from the line and hurried for the cellar, clutching her ration cards in one hand and the family Bible in the other. Above her, the night sky was laced with searchlights and the thunder of engines. British bombers, Tommies, neighbors called them, roared toward Bremen's shipyards again. The air tasted of soot and fear. Dust sifted from the cellar beams as anti-aircraft guns barked across the city. Marta's neighbors pressed close together, their whispers drowned by the shriek of falling bombs. She thought of her son, Hans, captured somewhere in Africa, though she had not heard from him since April. She imagined him starving in a desert cage, as Nazi officials claimed. The propaganda posters pasted on every street corner warned that Americans tortured prisoners, that surrender meant dishonor and death. When the raid lifted, the family climbed from the cellar to find a bakery destroyed, its ovens buried beneath rubble. Bread would be scarce tomorrow. Butter was already rationed to just over 2 ounces per week. Coffee substitutes, roasted acorns and barley, were bitter reminders of abundance lost. In the marketplace, women argued over turnips and cabbage. Everyone knew the Reich was winning because the radio said so. But Marta's stomach told a different story. 2 weeks later, as she sorted through the post, she found a card with unfamiliar markings. The top line read, Kriegsgefangenenpost, prisoner of war mail. Beneath it, in her son's handwriting, were the words she never expected to see. I am well. I have food and clothing. Do not worry. Hans. Her knees weakened. The neighbors stared as she held the card to her chest, tears running down her cheeks. It was postmarked from Texas, of all places. America. She read it again and again, tracing the censor's black stamp across the bottom. The card was short, barely 24 lines aloud, but it was more than she had dared to hope for. The neighbors muttered. Some called it Allied trickery. Others warned her to burn it, lest the Gestapo suspect her of spreading enemy lies. But Marta knew her son's handwriting. No propaganda machine could counterfeit the uneven way Hans formed his capital letters. She folded the card into her Bible, safe between the pages of Psalms. At supper that evening, she stared at her ration of bread, dense, gray, and stretched with fillers, and thought of Hans. He wrote that he had been given clean clothes, bread, even coffee. Coffee. The word stung. She had not tasted real beans since 1940. The Americans, it seemed, were feeding their captives better than Germany fed its citizens. The next week brought another raid. Fires swept through the docks, and the smell of burning timber lingered for days. Marta clung to Hans's card through it all. Each time she unfolded it, she felt both comfort and dissonance. Her son was alive, yes, but he was alive in the care of the enemy who bombed her city. She could not reconcile the two images, American planes raining destruction by night, American guards handing her son stationery and stamps by day. Word spread quietly through Bremen streets. Other mothers received cards as well. Some dared to believe them. Others insisted the Allies forced prisoners to lie. Still, the letters circulated, whispered about in bread lines and air raid shelters. They were small things, just scraps of paper, but they carried weight heavier than bombs. Marta began to dream of Hans returning home after the war, thin but alive. She pictured him handing her more of those cards, souvenirs of captivity. She also began to question, if America could afford to give prisoners bread and coffee, how much more must they have for their own soldiers? And if they could send letters across oceans in wartime, what else were they capable of? That night, she tucked Hans's postcard back into the Bible. The city around her shook under another wave of bombers, but she whispered a prayer of thanks. Her son lived, and somewhere across the sea, in a land of impossible abundance, he was writing to her still. As the cellar door rattled under another explosion, Marta clutched the card tighter, knowing the words of her captured son had pierced the lies of her own government. July 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The Texas air pressed down like a wet blanket. Heat shimmered above the red dirt parade ground, cicadas drilling a steady rhythm from the cottonwoods beyond the wire. Gefreiter Hans Keller stood in a line of prisoners that kinked and doubled back on itself, every man clutching a thin, cream-colored form printed with block letters at the top. Kriegsgefangenenpost, prisoner of war mail. He kept running his thumb along the edge to prove it was real. Paper. Ink. A space marked Absender, sender, followed by 24 stingy lines. A corporal from the U.S. Army, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening his khaki, moved along the line with a clipboard. Name, camp number, barracks. His German was serviceable, learned, Keller guessed, in a high school far from here. Keller answered, and the corporal nodded him toward a wooden table under an awning where 2 fans chopped heat into smaller pieces. The forms were standard issue, the guards explained. 1 letter and 1 postcard per week for enlisted men. 5 letters and 5 postcards per month for generals and senior officers. Free postage. Write in German. No maps, no unit designations, no mention of guards' routines or fence layouts. The camp's censor office would blot anything that strayed, but the letters would go. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, Article 36, Keller was told, the United States must let him correspond, and this part made him dizzy. They intended to do so without delay as punishment. He stared at the blank lines, the inked borders, the tiny printed instructions. None of this fit the picture he had carried from North Africa. The barbaric American who shot prisoners, who laughed while they starved. The men in this camp were watchful, yes. Rifles sat easy in their hands. But they also handed him paper and said, "Write your mother." Keller began carefully. "Liebe Mutter." He paused. The fan rattled. Sweat ran down his spine. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he had eaten stew last night, thick with meat, that the coffee in the mess hall smelled like a Bremen cafe before the war, that the barracks mattresses were filled with new ticking that itched only a little. But he had heard rumors too, that letters praising America would be mocked as propaganda, that some of the hardliners inside the wire, their own camp police, watched the mail as closely as the Americans did. The truth could be dangerous in both directions. He settled on careful phrases. I am in good health. I am treated according to regulations. He stopped himself from writing Texas, remembering the brief the interpreter had given. No locations. He wrote instead, across the sea. He resisted mentioning the canteen coupons, 80 cents a day. They were paid for work details or the tractors he had seen on a nearby farm, machines larger than the ones that had tilled fields in his district back home. He filled the 24th line and lifted his pen reluctantly, as if the motion might squeeze out one more sentence. Next, a clerk said. Keller stepped forward, handed over the card, and watched it pass into a different world. Inside the censor hut, he could see through the doorframe. A row of desks faced a wall of pigeonholes. Men and women in uniform shirts bent their heads over German script, pencils tapping, rubber stamps standing at the ready like small black sentries. Every few moments, the heavy thump of a stamp landed on paper. Passed. U.S. Censor. The hut itself smelled of ink and creosote from the fence posts outside. 2 perimeter fences ran parallel. The space between them raked flat so footprints told their own stories. Light towers bracketed the compound, their lamps dim in daylight, their silhouettes like watchful metronomes. A sign near the gate warned in German and English that the use of deadly force was authorized. The Americans were generous with paper. They were not sentimental about security. "Work detail this afternoon," a guard told Keller when he stepped back into the glare. "Fields, bring your canteen." The man's tone was flat, almost bored. Routine had settled over the place the way dust settles, layer by layer, until even the barbs on the wire wore a coat of Texas red. Keller drifted toward the shade of the barracks, unsure whether to feel relief or shame. The letter would cross the ocean in a burlap sack, transfer to the Red Cross, and, if luck held, arrive in Bremen, smudged and miraculous. The thought was so tender it hurt. He pictured his mother's hands unfolding the card, tracing the censor's black mark with a finger, and believed for the first time since surrender that he might be more than a number in someone's ledger. A breeze carried in the smell of rain, or perhaps it was just the water truck rattling down the lane. A prisoner near him laughed, too loudly, about American kindness. Another snapped, "Shut up," in the clipped dialect of the Ruhr. Keller looked at the wire, then at the mail hut. Between them, it seemed, stood the difference between 2 worlds, one that trusted rules and one that trusted fear. A runner from headquarters jogged past, arms full of fresh forms. Paper. More paper. When the door swung open, Keller caught one last glimpse of Whitaker's stamp rising and falling, steady as a factory press. The rhythm of past, past, past followed Keller back to the barracks, an odd, soft drumbeat that said the war could reach across an ocean, and so could he. August 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The mailbags stacked higher than a man's head. Heavy canvas sacks lined the corridor of the administration building, bulging with postcards and letters written in neat German script. Captain James Whitaker stood at the threshold, arms folded, as clerks wrestled with the load. The morning heat pressed through the open windows, carrying in the smell of dust and machine oil. To Whitaker, it felt less like a prisoner camp and more like the loading dock of a factory, except the product here was words. He thought back to his years teaching history in a Kansas high school, lecturing on the Civil War. He used to tell his students that supply lines, not just bravery, decided battles. Now he found himself overseeing a supply chain of an entirely different kind. Instead of ammunition or fuel, the U.S. Army was pushing millions of German sentences across the Atlantic. Every sack of mail was evidence of America's industrial democracy, abundance harnessed not only to build ships and tanks, but to let the enemy write home. The numbers were almost absurd. By May 1945, records would show 425,871 Axis prisoners held in the United States. Of those, nearly 372,000 were German. Each man was entitled to send regular correspondence. That meant millions of letters, postcards, and capture cards processed through camps like Hearn. The camp itself served as the central hub for prisoner mail, routing correspondence from more than 70 satellite camps across the South and Midwest. It was logistics at the scale of an Army Corps, except its weapon was stationary. Whitaker paced among the clerks as they worked. The censor room had grown into a world of its own. Desks lined up in ranks, typewriters clicking, rubber stamps falling in steady rhythm. Passed, passed, passed. They read every letter, blotting out with black ink any hint of locations, troop strengths, or escape fantasies. Yet even redacted, the letters went through. Lurch's directive echoed in Whitaker's mind. We are not going to lower ourselves to Nazi standards. It was more than just moral posture. Whitaker suspected the War Department understood the strategic angle. Every card that reached Bremen or Hamburg contradicted Goebbels' propaganda. The Nazis told their people that captured sons were starved or executed. Then a mother received a card stamped U.S. Censor that said her boy was in good health, fed, even paid for work. Doubt spread like water through cracks in a wall. These letters were, in their own quiet way, artillery shells. A clerk named Peterson approached with a stack. "Captain, should we hold these?" They mentioned the farm equipment again. Whitaker scanned the lines. A prisoner described driving a tractor, marveling at its size. Nothing military, no details of locations. "Let it through," Whitaker said. "If they're amazed by our tractors, all the better." Peterson grinned faintly. "Yes, sir." The impossible statistic sat in the back of Whitaker's mind. The United States had already produced 299,000 military aircraft between 1940 and 1941-1945, more planes than Germany could dream of. If a prisoner wanted to brag about tractors, he could. Let Berlin try to explain away abundance. By afternoon, the sacks were sealed and carried to the trucks waiting by the gate. Guards hoisted them like ammunition crates, loading them under armed escort. The letters would travel by rail to New York, then by ship across U-boat-haunted waters to Lisbon or Geneva, where the Red Cross would forward them into Germany. Whitaker marveled at the protection lavished on them. In a sense, they were more carefully guarded than bullets. A single sack of these postcards carried more strategic weight than a box of cartridges. He lingered by the loading dock as the last truck pulled away, the canvas flapping in the hot wind. Over the fence line, the Texas fields stretched out, cotton, wheat, and sorghum growing in neat rows, some tended now by German POW labor. Beyond those fields, rail lines spidered across the continent, feeding the Atlantic ports. All of it, the farms, the factories, the trains, was part of the same machine that gave his clerks paper and stamps to pass into enemy hands. Whitaker rubbed the sweat from his brow. He had not fired a shot in this war, but today he had overseen the dispatch of thousands of small weapons, letters with the power to pierce illusions more effectively than any rifle round. Watching the dust settle on the empty dock, Whitaker thought, "Every envelope we send is a quiet bombardment, striking deeper than any artillery piece ever could." September 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. Sergeant Manuel Rodriguez leaned against the rail of the guard tower, his rifle propped nearby. The Texas sun hammered down, bleaching the parade ground until it looked like bone. Below, German prisoners moved in files toward the work trucks, their shadows sharp against the dust. Some carried hoes and shovels for the fields. Others slung canvas bags filled with letters bound for the censor's office. Rodriguez lit a cigarette and drew deep, squinting across the wire. He thought of the 36th Infantry Division, his division, the Texas Division, now bleeding in Italy. In letters from friends, he read of Salerno's beaches slick with blood, of men pinned under German fire in the mountains. Rodriguez was stuck here, standing watch over the very enemy that was killing his buddies overseas. At first, it gnawed at him. He wanted to be across the ocean, fighting. But gradually he realized this post had its own battlefield, measured not in bodies, but in symbols. Every day he saw Germans eating in the mess hall, plates of meat and potatoes, slices of white bread thicker than the rations his cousins in Mexico could dream of. The prisoners worked fields for 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, enough to buy cigarettes, Coca-Cola, and chocolate. To them, it felt like privilege. To Rodriguez, it felt like strategy. He had heard the numbers from the officers. America's shipyards had already launched over 2,000 Liberty ships, each in weeks rather than months. The aircraft factories, working day and night, had produced nearly 300,000 planes since 1940. In Germany, people queued for thin slices of bread. Here, prisoners smoked American cigarettes rolled by the billions. If abundance was a weapon, then every Coke bottle in the camp was part of the arsenal. That morning, Rodriguez watched a group of prisoners unloading farm equipment. One stopped to marvel at a John Deere tractor, running his hand along the green-painted hood as if it were a rare artifact. Rodriguez chuckled. In Germany, most farms still hitched horses to plows. Here, machines did the work. To the POWs, even the countryside spoke of America's industrial might. Later, he patrolled the barracks. Inside, the Germans lounged on bunks, some playing cards, others writing letters. The forms were identical: 1 letter, 1 postcard per week. A young prisoner looked up as Rodriguez passed. The man held a half-finished note in careful script, his face tight with concentration. Rodriguez didn't speak German, but he didn't need to. He knew what the boy was writing. "I am alive. I am treated well. Do not worry." As Rodriguez walked the aisle, he thought about the contradiction. His own division was fighting for yards of Italian soil at a cost of hundreds of lives. Yet here their captured enemies sat under ceiling fans, scribbling reassurances home. Still, he reminded himself, this too was war. These letters would find their way into German kitchens and shelters, whispering truths louder than Allied propaganda. That evening, Rodriguez sat with another guard in the tower, passing a canteen between them. The air was thick with the smell of manure from the fields. The guard cursed under his breath. "Hard to stomach, isn't it? My brother's in the Third Army, and these krauts get more meat than he does." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Yeah, but think about it this way. If we can afford to feed prisoners like this, what do you think we're giving our boys at the front?" The other guard grunted, considering. Rodriguez let the silence stretch. The truth was obvious. America's capacity was so immense it could drown the enemy in kindness while still burying him in bombs. The prisoners returned from the fields at dusk, their boots scuffing the gravel. Dust rose like smoke. Rodriguez rested his rifle across his knees and watched them file inside, each man passing through the gate with weary shoulders and often a folded letter tucked into his pocket. Rodriguez exhaled smoke into the evening air and thought, this is how we win, not just with bullets, but with too much of everything to count. October 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. A scrap of paper fluttered in the potbelly stove, curled and vanished. The barracks smelled of damp wool and coal smoke, the kind of heavy air that made voices go quiet. Hans Keller watched the ash drift like gray snow and knew what it had been. A postcard that said too much. No American had burned it. This was an inside job. They called themselves the Camp Police, self-appointed guardians of loyalty. Not many, half a dozen hardened men in a camp of thousands, but enough. They kept lists and watched mail call, eyes sharp for the wrong tone. Any hint that America was generous, that the guard who checked the fence last night had also pressed an extra ladle of stew, that the canteen coupons, 80 cents a day, could buy chocolate. Word traveled that such letters endangered morale. Some were confiscated before the censors ever saw them. Others were returned with warnings written in the margins. Write like a soldier, not a beggar. Keller had learned the signs. A conversation would stop when one of the loyalists stepped into the barracks aisle. Men folded letters mid-sentence, slid them under blankets, started talking about harvests back home. A few times, this is how survivors would later describe it, someone who praised America too openly fell down the stairs or picked a fight. The Americans patrolled the perimeter. Inside the wire, fear wore German boots. That evening, Keller sat at a rough-hewn table with his postcard. The rules were clear. 1 letter and 1 postcard per week, no locations, no mention of guards or schedules, 24 lines only. The U.S. censors would scratch out military hints with precise black bars, then stamp past and send the card on its long voyage. Truck, rail, ship, Red Cross. a journey as disciplined as any convoy. He had seen the mailroom, desks in ranks, pigeonholes labeled by German provinces, rubber stamps thumping like a metronome. He began, Liebe Mutter, I am well. He wanted to add, the coffee is real, but paused. Someone coughed behind him. He wrote instead, the food is sufficient. He wanted to tell her about the tractor he had seen on a nearby farm, green paint, the throttle a smooth arc under his palm, but scrawled, we work outdoors. He wanted to say the guards were strict but fair. He wrote, discipline is maintained. A boot heel clicked at the bunk's end. Writing about the fine American table, Keller? The voice came soft, almost friendly. The man's eyes were not. Keller kept his gaze on the card. I write about regulations, he said, steady. It was true. He had come to trust rules. The 1929 Geneva Convention had insisted he be allowed to write, and the Americans, so far, had obeyed the letter of it. The loyalist leaned closer, breath sour with tobacco. Make sure your mother understands you are a soldier of Germany. I am, Keller said. It was also true. The two truths, German and American, rubbed together like flint, throwing sparks he could feel in his throat. When the man moved on, Keller forced his hand to stay even. He ended with a coded honesty. I have what I need. It would be enough for his mother to read between the lines. It would be bland enough to pass under both sets of eyes. Around him, the barracks murmured. Someone at the stove fed in another sheet. The paper hissed, blazed, died. The room filled with the small sounds of captivity, a deck of cards shuffling, a pencil squeaking on cheap stock, a spoon tapping enamel. Through the wall slats, Keller could hear the tower's generator hum. It was a layered cage, double fences outside, watch lights on the corners, and this, an inner fence made of suspicion and threat. He signed Hans and carried the card to the slot by the door. Each step felt loud. He slid it through and imagined its journey, a canvas sack on a truck, then a rail car, then a cargo hold under a Liberty ship's thundering engines. He had learned one more impossible thing in this camp. America could move words with the same relentlessness it moved steel. In 1943, U.S. mills poured more than 90 million tons of crude steel, nearly 3 times Germany's output. Enough, Keller thought, to build not only ships and planes, but an entire system of fences, towers, desks, and stamps to manage an army of prisoners and their paper. Back at his bunk, he felt the familiar mix of relief and dread. Relief that the card was gone, beyond the reach of the barracks' small tyrannies. Dread that somewhere between Texas and Bremen, a U-boat's torpedo or a bureaucrat's drawer might swallow it whole. Outside, a truck backfired. A few prisoners flinched, then laughed at themselves. The night air smelled of creosote and distant rain. The loyalists drifted toward the door, their silhouettes slicing the lantern glow, and the room exhaled. Keller lay back and pictured a field beyond the wire, engines coughing to life, belts turning, blades flashing, knowing that tomorrow's work detail would carry him closer to the secret he could not write. America had turned abundance into a weapon. November 1943, Brazos Valley, Texas. The morning began with the cough of diesel engines. Keller climbed onto the flatbed truck with 30 other prisoners, their boots scraping the wood as the guard slammed the tailgate shut. The truck rattled through the gates of Camp Hearn, past the double fences and watchtowers, then out into Texas farmland where the air smelled of dew and soil instead of creosote and sweat. By mid-morning, the convoy reached the fields. There it stood, a John Deere combine harvester, its green paint glinting like new armor under the sun. To Keller, raised on a farm outside Bremen, the machine looked like something out of science fiction. Back home, his father had relied on horses to pull the plow. their ribs showing by the winter's end. Even the tractors they had seen in Germany were modest, two-cylinder machines that sputtered and groaned. This combine was different, taller than a man, powered by a throaty four-cylinder engine, its belts and gears humming with effortless strength. The guard pointed them toward rows of wheat, and soon Keller found himself hauling sacks while the combine devoured grain at a pace he could barely comprehend. He tried to calculate, how many men with scythes would it take to equal one of these machines? 50? 100? He gave up. The numbers felt unreal. Sergeant Rodriguez watched from the shade of a pecan tree, his rifle slung casually across his chest. He had seen this before, POWs pausing mid-task, staring at American machinery as though it were sorcery. Rodriguez didn't need to explain. The machines explained themselves. They were proof that America's power wasn't just in weapons. It was in tractors that could feed armies and prisoners alike. Rodriguez thought about the latest report pinned to the camp bulletin board. America had already launched over 2,000 Liberty ships, with another 100 sliding down the ways every month. The same shipyards that ferried tanks and fuel across the Atlantic could just as easily ferry wheat. And then there were the aircraft. By the end of 1945, nearly 299,000 planes would roll from American factories. It was an impossible statistic, one the Luftwaffe could never match. Keller hoisted a sack onto the truck bed, sweat streaking his temples. The combine clattered behind him, a machine that never tired, never faltered. He imagined the reports filtering back to Berlin, German engineers measuring production quotas in dozens while America measured in tens of thousands. It was a war not only of soldiers, but of math, and Germany's sums would never add up. During their break, the prisoners sat beneath the combine's shadow, passing canteen cups of water. One muttered, "With one of these, my village could feed 3 towns." Another said nothing, just stared at the machine as if memorizing it. Keller scribbled a note in his mind for his next postcard. "We work with machines larger than barns." He would not write it, of course. It would never pass censors or camp police, but he could not unsee it. Rodriguez lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl upward. He remembered his cousin's letter from Salerno, describing American GIs trudging up rocky slopes with packs heavy with rations, ammunition, even spare boots. "We never go without," the cousin had written. Rodriguez looked at the POWs hunched in the wheat field and thought, even our prisoners never go without. By afternoon, the trucks were filled with grain. The combine was parked under a shed, ready for the next day's work. Keller climbed back aboard, his body aching, but his mind reeling. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. America did not merely outfight Germany. It outproduced, outfed, outsupplied it at every turn. Machines like this were as decisive as tanks on a battlefield. The convoy rattled back toward Herne as dusk painted the sky orange. Keller sat against the rail, dust coating his uniform, and watched the fields roll past. He thought of his mother queuing for bread rations in Bremen and of the wheat pouring into American silos by the ton. As the camp fences came back into view, Keller realized that the real barbed wire around Germany was not steel. It was scarcity, and America had already cut through it with machines. December 1943, Bremen, Germany. Snow powdered the ruins of Bremen, softening edges of shattered rooftops. Marta Keller shuffled forward in the ration line, her breath clouding the cold air. In her hand, a ration card promised half a loaf stretched with fillers. When the clerk weighed her slice, she saw daylight through it. That evening, by kerosene light, Marta unfolded Hans's postcard. It bore the black stamp, "Passed, U.S. Censor." 24 lines in his careful hand. He was healthy, worked outdoors, had food and clothing. She read between the lines. He was alive, yes, but more than that, he was cared for. Rumors spread quietly through the city. Other mothers clutched similar cards. Prisoners in America received not only bread but canteen coupons, 80 cents a day, enough to buy cigarettes, chocolate, even Coca-Cola. Marta compared this to Bremen's bitter coffee substitutes made from acorns. The contrast gnawed at her. Propaganda still thundered from radios. The Reich was unbreakable, the Führer invincible. But mothers trusted their sons more than broadcasts. When Hans mentioned tractors larger than barns, Marta pictured them devouring wheat at a pace no German farm could match. In 1943 alone, American farmers harvested 3.2 billion bushels of wheat, while her neighbors quarreled over turnips. Bombs continued to fall. In December, British raids set shipyards ablaze, filling the air with the stench of burned timber. Marta clutched Hans's letters in the cellar. Each one contradicted the Reich's promises and made her wonder, how could Germany prevail against a nation that fed its prisoners better than she was fed at home? She folded the postcard back into her Bible. Abundance, she realized, was America's deadliest weapon. Marta whispered into the dark, "If plenty itself is a weapon, then we are already defeated." December 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. Frost rimmed the barbed wire. Prisoners muttered about a German breakthrough in Belgium, Hitler's last gamble in the Ardennes. For a moment, hope flickered. Some spoke of Paris falling again. Hans Keller listened but did not join. He had seen too much. That week, with pen hovering over his postcard, he wrote what he had avoided for months. "Mother, the war is lost." It was the truth written in numbers. In 1944, America produced over 90 million tons of crude steel, triple Germany's best. Liberty ships filled harbors faster than U-boats could sink them. By year's end, over 2,000 had already been launched. Factories turned out tens of thousands of Shermans, while the Luftwaffe shrank daily. Sergeant Rodriguez shook his head at the rumors. "They'll throw everything they've got," he told another guard, "but we'll bury them in steel." Stars and Stripes confirmed it. American divisions regrouping, bombers clearing skies. Germany's push was already collapsing. Keller lay in his bunk listening to the stove pop. Around him, some still clung to illusions. He thought of tractors in Texas fields, of chocolate in the camp canteen, of coffee steaming in tin mugs. If this was life for prisoners, what must the frontline Americans enjoy? As his postcard began its journey, Keller knew. Truth traveled faster than any rumor, carried on paper across oceans. April 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The war's end was near. Newspapers spoke of Allied armies crossing the Rhine, Soviets closing on Berlin. But Captain Whitaker's battlefield was paper. Filing cabinets groaned with records, names, barracks, dates. Each card matched to a letter carried across seas. The tally was staggering. By spring, over 425,000 Axis prisoners had lived on American soil. Millions of letters had passed through censor rooms where clerks bent over German script, stamping in rhythm. Passed, passed, passed. Whitaker knew this was strategy, not charity. Every postcard undermined Goebbels' lies. Mothers read that their sons were healthy, even paid for work. Doubt seeped into Germany like water through cracks. Sergeant Rodriguez returned from the gate, dust on his boots. "Sir, they say whole divisions surrendered in the Ruhr. Too many prisoners, not enough wire." Whitaker smiled. America could build wire, ships, or planes faster than Germany could destroy them. The impossible statistic remained: 299,000 aircraft built by war's end. No number from the Reich could match it. At the loading dock, guards lifted sacks of mail. Rodriguez hefted one. "Heavier than it looks." "Words usually are," Whitaker replied. He knew these letters were as decisive as artillery. America had proved it could fight with steel and with paper, and both overwhelmed the enemy. As the trucks rolled toward the railhead, Whitaker thought, history would remember the battles, but perhaps it should also count the postcards. May 1945, Bremen, Germany. Church bells tolled unevenly over a city of rubble. News spread. Germany had surrendered. Marta Keller stood amid ruins, clutching Hans's postcards. Each bore the stamp of American censors. Each had kept her hope alive. She remembered the first one, how impossible it seemed that her son could write from across the ocean. Yet the cards kept coming, brief, careful lines. I am well. I work outdoors. I have food. Behind those words lay abundance she could scarcely imagine. Hans, still in Texas, felt relief more than triumph. He was alive, one of hundreds of thousands of POWs America had fed and housed. The statistics were monumental. 2,710 Liberty ships, nearly 299,000 planes, 90 million tons of steel annually. Germany had never stood a chance against such arithmetic. In Bremen, Marta showed her neighbors the cards. Some doubted. Others whispered that America's kindness to prisoners revealed more about power than cruelty ever could. She tucked the bundle into her Bible, the paper as sacred now as Scripture. For Hans, captivity had become proof of America's might. Bread, tractors, Coca-Cola, even postage, all demonstrated that democracy could outproduce dictatorship not only in weapons, but in mercy. The war had ended in fire and rubble, but Marta knew its truth was confirmed in ink and paper, echoes across the ocean that told her son still lived, and told Germany it had already lost.